not willing, then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? Another formulation. C.S. Lewis articulated it this way before responding to it in his book, The Problem of Pain. If God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he'd be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore God lacks either goodness or power above. That's the way the problem has often been presented in the past. Here's a one-liner that captures some of the apparent implications of the problem. Is it ethical to be devoted to a God who allows children to suffer and die, afraid and alone? As I go on, I just want to emphasize that there have been lots of attempts to solve this problem that actually do more harm than good. And because they illustrate why explaining away evil is problematic, I'm going to go through some of them. We've heard all of them before. Rather than grieving with parents who have just experienced the loss of a child, some people say something along these lines. I know your son was killed by a drunk driver, but don't be sad. You'll see him in the afterlife. You should actually be happy. He's in heaven now. But we all know that that is of no help to someone who's grieving. Some people say that suffering is not really that bad after all. It's not genuinely bad because it may make the universe as a whole better. But to say that the Holocaust was anything but despicably bad and evil is just wrong. Others say the suffering is not so bad after all because it helps us grow into mature people. But telling a mother whose child has just been killed that God allowed this evil so that she would grow in strength of character is wrong. We know that there is evil that degrades people rather than ennobling them. Finally, some say that suffering is always deserved. Some variation of what goes around comes around, or God's just punishing you for something you've done. But as I pointed out, sometimes suffering clearly affects the innocent. I think the sort of answers I've just given are more harmful than helpful, especially when they are given insensitively and in a way that belittles suffering. So I will be intentionally avoiding those, although I also don't want to deny that certain suffering brings about some good. We can all look back on tough experiences we have and genuinely say that they made us better people, though again, not all suffering is of this sort. Eric Cassell puts it nicely. Suffering reveals to the sufferer a greater depth of human experience and meaning. After the experience of suffering, the person is led to a richer understanding of the meaning of being human, a greater concern for the suffering of others, and away from the superficiality that too often characterize daily existence. So there is some suffering that creates challenge, character growth, and a healthy need for community. But as I mentioned, it's not. I'm not saying that it's all the suffering by any means. Here are a few of the explanations that I think may be more helpful to us. One thing that helps us understand the existence of suffering is it's called the free will defense. This idea is that the reason for much of our suffering is that we have free will, and we use this free will to choose to harm each other. This explains why you have things like slavery, systemic oppression, war, cycles of poverty, etc., as well as interpersonal problems such as unreconciled relationships, violence, and abuse. We have them because we choose them. Someone might ask, well, if God wanted to prevent all this evil, couldn't he stop us from doing it? Of course. He could have made us a bunch of robots who only do exactly what he wants. But then we wouldn't be anything like the created free beings that God wanted us to be. Beings who, like the Bible says, are made in God's image. If God wants beings who are able to choose to love, he also has to make beings that are able to choose to hate. Otherwise, our love is worthless. If I had a robotic wife, I could press the smooch button on her and get a kiss, but that wouldn't be worth it. As it is, however, I can choose to harm you, but I wouldn't. I can choose to be friendly to you. And best of all, I can choose to be so vulnerable with you, and you with me, that we enter into each other's worlds, growing in trust for each other as we cherish each other's beings, allowing a beautiful life-giving relationship to bud and blossom. intertwining of two narratives into one is truly special. You and I can choose to love each other despite our imperfections and the inevitability of misunderstanding and hurt that come with relationships. Perhaps some of us have loved and been loved in that way and experienced that to be among the sweetest things imaginable. We may still wonder, is our ability to love worth the suffering that comes with our ability to hate? Why do we have the capability to hurt and do damage to the extent that we do? Perhaps it would be better if we were free to love a lot and only hate a little. That sounds great. Do a lot of good and only a little bad. But if we think about it for a second, we'll realize that that isn't a real option. It's the most creative and free creatures that can do the most good and the most evil. Think of the extent to which a mouse, a child, a normal adult, and a genius can do good and evil. We all see that the genius can use her great creativity to do the most good and the most evil. With the creativity to put together a beautiful work of art comes creativity to put together an atomic bomb. We all know that our creativity can go toward love or toward hate. Whether there is more human creativity going towards good in the world than towards evil is an open question. This seems like a place where it might make sense to say that God has a perspective that we don't. Knowing all that people have experienced, will experience, and what he will do with our future, maybe the benefit of having free beings is so great that it can't be outweighed by even the terrible, admittedly terrible cost in the end. So the existence of suffering doesn't mean God can't exist or be good. It just means that if God thought it was worth it to create free beings. I know that's incomplete, but I still have time. It's no surprise that suffering bothers us and makes us ask, why is this happening? Why don't we think twice about asking why love is so good to us? Or why there's beauty that takes our breath away? Or why pleasure is so pleasurable? It's important to ask why we suffer, absolutely, and I don't want to belittle that. But it's also important to ask why we experience life as good. Consider how throughout history, people have repeatedly come to the conclusion that there is a God and that that God is good. Why would people come to believe in an all-good God before there were anesthetics, before thermostats and indoor plumbing, and before modern medicine alleviated many of our ailments? People cook up some crazy ideas, but this would have to be over the top, considering the amount of anguish people who believe in God have had to go through throughout history. It cannot have been pain-free bliss that made people believe that God was good. The only satisfactory explanation I can think of is that life has a certain quality to it, an awe-inspiring intrinsic significance that goes beyond what is helpful for survival, and that is it is experienced as good. Let's look at this quote. It's a little bit long, but bear with it. The mutual support developed out of the social needs to survive often goes beyond generosity and occasional sacrificial service. Sometimes human concern extends beyond one's own community to others, even to competitors. Some people are self-critical and change their view when confronted by evidence. Beauty is prized for its own sake. One man voluntarily took hemlock rather than betray his convictions about obedience to law. Others spoke truth to power at great risk and often at great cost. One taught inclusive love and accepted crucifixion out of his own embodiment of that love. Many others inspired by him have tried to make justice and righteousness effective in human society. What can all this mean? Must not something be at work other than narrow self-interest and absolutization of one's own group? Can we not call that God? Can we not find in events of this kind a clue to the nature and reality of that God? Maybe we can, but let's look at the alternative to believing in God. Suppose we decide that it's too hard to reconcile believing in God with the problem of suffering in the world, and we adopt the view that it is a godless universe. In a completely naturalistic universe, we are only here as the result of a mindless, unguided process of evolution. This view creates an entirely different problem related to suffering. Why should we trust our feelings that suffering is actually bad, a thing that shouldn't happen? After all, who's to say that it shouldn't happen? Isn't that just the way the world works? In any case, if our brains are simply tools we evolved to enhance our chances for survival, then our feelings that suffering is wrong don't reflect a universal reality that harming others is evil. They're simply a byproduct of evolution designed to motivate each of us to ensure our survival. Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous new atheists and brilliant evolutionary biologists, has this to say. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. This raises an important question. Is human suffering evil because humans have an inherent God-given value and because there really is a universal reality that allows us to say this suffering really is evil and ought to be stopped? If not, we have no fundamental basis to be concerned about human suffering other than the statement, I want that suffering to stop because my biology makes it feel uncomfortable to me. My point is not that only people who believe in God care about suffering. Not at all. Most people are horrified by extreme suffering, and in terms of helping to alleviate people's suffering, some of my atheist friends put me and lots of Christians to absolute shame. But my point is this. Our view that human suffering is wrong only makes sense in a God-created universe. The problem with taking God out of the picture is that when confronted with suffering, all we can really say is, that's just the way the universe works. Though it makes me feel bad, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's hard to say why we should take this feeling gravely serious and even shape our lives around it unless there is a real goodness which underlies the universe. If we're thinking about this issue all the time, as I know so many of us are, and realize that it is extremely important, I think this should make us wonder whether the ultimate reality behind the universe is goodness. Tim Keller sums it up nicely by saying that people we believe ought not to suffer, be excluded, die of hunger or oppression. But the evolutionary mechanism of natural selection depends on death, destruction, and violence of the strong against the weak. These things are all perfectly natural. On what basis, then, does the atheist judge the natural world to be horribly wrong, unfair, and unjust? The non-believer in God doesn't have a good basis for being outraged at injustice. If you are sure that this natural world is unjust and filled with evil, you're assuming the reality of some extra-natural standard by which to make your judgment. I think the appetite we all have for justice is a compelling reason to believe in God in the midst of all the suffering we see. We have an appetite for justice, and there is no justice. Really? It would be a strange world if our desires and appetites simply could not be fulfilled. We have an appetite for food, and there is food. We have an appetite for sex, and there is sex. We have an appetite for sleep, and there is sleep. Imagine if we all went about our lives hungry for food, for something substantial to fill our bellies, but we actually happen to be creatures that receive nutrients through our pores. We stayed alive because we got the necessary nutrients, but we always yearn to eat a burger. That would be a pretty absurd existence. I know many, if not all of us, have a burning desire for justice, a desire which we know is central to our humanity. And yet, that hunger for justice seems almost misplaced in a universe without God. After all, if the universe is a brute fact, it just happens to exist and has no explanation, there's no hope that justice will come to those who have suffered. And there's no hope that their suffering can be redeemed. If an omnipotent, loving God has eternity to make it worth every suffering person's while, then there's hope. Now, I'm a philosophy major, and that's not a rigorous argument for Christianity. And I'm not trying to say that Christianity is a sort of wish fulfillment. Rather, it's an important fact. What I just presented is an important fact to keep in mind when we're considering this problem. Though there is no philosophical problem of suffering without there being a good, powerful God, the suffering in the world does not go away if we get rid of God. If we get rid of belief in God, the suffering remains. But what we certainly have done is remove the possibility of all hope. I've given you some philosophical responses to the question of God and suffering, but I'd like to move beyond philosophical propositions and arguments. My main reason for doing that is that that's what the Bible does. Many Christians have missed this point, trying to give philosophical responses to evil, when the Bible's primary response to the problem of suffering is not a propositional statement, but a story. And I find the story profoundly helpful. Just as we get to know people better through hearing their stories than by hearing a list of their characteristics read aloud. in the biblical narrative, we get to know the character of God in a profound way. With that in mind, let me tell you what I see in that narrative. For one, God never justifies evil or says it's part of some big plan of his. No, what's clear throughout the narrative is that God unequivocally hates evil and suffering, and more than we ever could. And responds to it with judgment, both punishing it and ultimately destroying it, making a way to new, abundant life. Throughout the biblical story, oh gosh, are y'all with me? I'm fading. Throughout the biblical story, God is indignant at the fact that people allow other human beings to even be poor, and that they don't care about the suffering of others. When people actively oppress others and perpetuate injustice, God reacts with fearsome intensity. When a human being is treated unjustly, God takes it personally. Injustice is an assault on the worth of a person, and that is an assault on God. God stands in solidarity with the poor and the oppressed, being especially sensitive to their cries for help. One of my favorite ways God fights oppression is through what's called the Jubilee year. In the Old Testament, God said that every 50 years, all debts were to be canceled, so that the oppression of social class reproduction would never exist. The Sabbath day ensured that thanks, Karen. Where to put this? So the Jubilee year was a canceling of all debts, and this happened every 50 years. So there was no working class parents have kids with working class jobs. There was and none of the other reproductions. That was just something that was unacceptable. Many of God's promises are directed specifically to the oppressed. Promises for justice, for freedom, and security. God demands that special attention be given to travelers, widows, orphans, and the poor. According to the biblical narrative, suffering and death will not have the last word. The reason that I trust that suffering won't have the last word isn't actually a reason, but a person. That person is Jesus. The apex of the Christian narrative is God giving up power and safety to become a poor, periodically homeless human being who served the people that society despises and marginalizes and became one of them himself. Jesus announced who he was and what he was about by saying this: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of the sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." The entire story of Jesus' life is focused on the defeat of suffering and death. Jesus spent most of his time going from town to town, healing people who were broken down by diseases, pains, and conditions. The other thing he did was teach, and we all know that much of what he taught was how we should love one another, that everything else would sort itself out if we love God with our entire beings, and inextricably tied to that, love our neighbor as ourselves. The two come together when Jesus presents them. If that's how we lived, if we were relying on a connection with the source of all love as a fuel for our lives, we would not cause others to suffer, and we would meet the suffering of others the way Jesus did, with powerful compassion. One of my favorite examples of Jesus' powerful compassion involves his friend Lazarus. Lazarus had passed away while Jesus was in another town, and Mary, Lazarus' sister, weeps over her brother. Let's look at their interaction. Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Just after this, Jesus raises Lazarus from the Why did he weep? After all, he knew he was going to bring Lazarus back from the dead. Yet Jesus was so moved by the sadness that death and suffering caused his friends that he couldn't help but weep with them. His compassion was powerful. Nothing demonstrated Jesus' powerful compassion, of course, more fully than the cross. If Jesus was God, what was he doing on a cross? God on a cross. God literally suffering from head to toe. God suffering at all. Why? What that tells me is that God does not remain distant from human suffering, but becomes part of it. Recognizing the centrality and seriousness of suffering in the world and experiencing it along with us. His compassion was powerful. The cross doesn't answer the question, God, why are you allowing suffering and evil to continue? But it tells us what the answer can't be. It can't be that he doesn't love us, doesn't care, or that he's removed or indifferent. He came and plunged himself into human suffering. But ultimately, Jesus' crucifixion is not just an example of God suffering with us, because God follows it with his resurrection. The point is that God finally does defeat evil, suffering, and death in Jesus. He takes it onto himself and then bursts through the other side, paving a way for human beings to experience new life in him, and hope for a future reality of justice, rightness, and healing that he's ushering in. So in Jesus, we don't get an easy answer to suffering. That it's no big deal, or that we should just ignore it, or that good people don't suffer. Instead, in God's own example, that we see in God's own example that we will have to go through suffering. A suffering that is undeniably evil, but that we have a hope for new life in him. And we have the help of a God who is on our side in his opposition to evil, and who is powerfully compassionate toward us in our suffering. Empowered by this compassion, we are to go and be with the suffering, weep with them, share their joy, and suffer with them. One reason I see the narrative of the Bible as so compelling is the radical action that Jesus' story requires of us. It requires that we all participate in the redemption of death and suffering that Jesus' resurrection set in motion. Jesus calls us to make others' well-being just as important to us as our own. This is not helping the so-called other when we have time or money left over. Rather, in light of the poverty-induced suffering that exists, we are supposed to celebrate simplicity, moderation, and painfully sacrificial generosity. The other becomes your neighbor, your sister, your friend. We are not to see ourselves as benevolent donors to the poor. Instead, we are called to make their burdens our own. I want to just, it's a good time to say that that's not always what the church has done. But I firmly believe that that's what Jesus taught. Let's just consider this. The end of the unjust suffering of the world's oppressed poor will start with the voluntary suffering of the non-poor. Are we willing to buy that? This is one of the big things that makes me feel like we can trust God, is that he requires that much of us, that he wants us to see other people as so worthy of our suffering so that they don't have to suffer. Here's just a way of thinking about it that I think can help just fill this out for us. I don't know if you guys have heard of John Perkins. Probably not. I wouldn't have heard of him if I hadn't taken like a class on this. So John Perkins is a Baptist minister, and these are his 3 R's of community development: relocation, reconciliation, and redistribution. So relocation, I guess I just want us to think about the implications of this. If we think about relocation in this way, that only by joining a community do a community's needs become one's own. of us, this means going back into the neighborhoods we came from. And I don't want to belittle how painful and almost paradoxical something that can be. But if we all relocated to a community that we wanted to experience love, and that we wanted to help break out of a cycle of poverty or a destructive cycle, if we were all willing to move into a place like that, be willing to learn so much, because we all bring different skills, different capital to that interaction. If we were willing to do that, in addition to the next two R's, I think our world would look very different. The next R is just as important: reconciliation. Because only by being committed to sharing life with people who are different than us because of ethnicity, culture, or generations of forced separation will we be able to love each other and learn to grow together in community. I'm just going to go to the next R as well. The third R is redistribution. If you have the first two R's and you're also willing to have that third one, then I see communities, I see oppression at its roots being torn out. If we're willing to really share the resources that we have, to share our life experiences, to share everything that makes us who we are, if we're willing to take our Pomona College education and go and live in the inner city, if we stay there a year, we'll do more harm than good. If we stay there 5 years, we'll break even. If we stay there 10 years, we could transform a community. And this makes me excited. I don't want to make it sound like it's formulaic and simple and like, okay, let's just all go live in the inner city. But I think this can change the world. And I think this is exactly what the gospel is trying to say. I think this is the core of Jesus' message. If we all loved each other enough to do this, things would change. One reason I trust God with suffering is that I've seen people live their lives in this way and transform neighborhoods. Inherent in doing this, of course, is the falling, giving up power and comfort so that the unjustly disenfranchised and the oppressed can be liberated and empowered. Are we willing to do that? To suffer so that those who unjustly suffer because of oppression and poverty can be restored. With the narrative of God and the Spirit of Jesus, I think that it's certain and real that that is the way that we're going to relieve as much suffering in the world as we possibly can. Jesus goes so far as to say we must lose our lives for his sake in order to find them. If we're willing to devote our lives to something that is outside of us, something that asks us to not climb up the ladder like our society wants to tell us, but to climb down the ladder like Jesus told us to, and like he did by leaving a perfect, painless independence to become human and suffer horribly till he died. If we're willing to do that, and there's a spiritual reality behind the universe that empowers and loves us into doing so, there is hope for this world now, and that hope will only grow. Can we trust God with suffering? I think we can. If we are willing to engage with the Christian narrative in a way that allows us to see the character of God, we will see that he's trustworthy. The character of a God who expresses his love for humanity by weeping with us, by suffering with us, and dying with us, in order to defeat death once and for all, is one we can trust. The fact that God would also require us to step into the suffering of others in order to break the cycles of injustice that keep so many people suffering shows us what type of God this is, a good one. And if he really does give us the strength to do that, the strength to relinquish power, to devote our lives to suffering with others and stopping injustice at its root, then he is powerful.